Hello, I'm Alexey Nikolsky, and this is my video that examines the phenomenon of musical beat. Lots of people think that the beat in music is something so basic and mundane that it needs no explanation. And indeed, hardly any textbook on music bothers to define the beat, let alone discuss it. Even the most comprehensive reference source on music in English, the Grove Dictionary, covers the entire topic of musical beat in meager 2 sentences. Most musicians understand the beat as a regular pulse that is somehow fixed in a musical composition and is immediately obvious to virtually every performer and listener. Yet no musician or even musicologist seems to be able to clearly spell out as what exactly in music is responsible for forming a beat. And if the beat indeed is that obvious and unequivocal, then why do musicians need a conductor to show it to them? To answer such questions, we are going to look into 3 domains. 1. The performance practice of music. 2. History of music. And 3. Psychoacoustics. So let's start our inquiry by testing how obvious the musical beat actually is. Listen to this simple piano piece by Schumann and try to tap to the beat. Here is the music. Were you able to find the beat? In case you thought that the beat starts right on the first note on the melody and goes on like this, pam 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 pam, then I'm afraid you got it wrong. Here is how Schumann notated his music. I've added vertical red lines where the beat actually falls. The first note that starts the melody comes right before the first beat, which falls on the first note of the bass and not the melody. In fact, the peculiar thing about this music is that its entire melody never falls on the beat, not even once. Now, I will show you where exactly the beat should be. Pam 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 pam. How do I know where the beat should go? Well, the music score shows the beat by its time signature. Here, the time signature is 2/8. This tells me that the beat unit is an eighth note and that it keeps going by a binary pulse of 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2. But the offbeat melody creates only one obstacle to finding the beat. Another obstacle comes from the irregular pace of the music. Schumann wants the performer to slow down and to pause at the end of every phrase. As you see, finding the beat might be tricky. Looking at the score can of course be helpful, but only if we can read music. However, even those of us who can read music are not going to run to pick up a score for each piece of music that we hear. And what if the score is not available? So we do need a way to figure out the beat in real time as we listen to music. Let's see what made us struggle finding the beat in Schumann's music. Obviously, Schumann conceived and notated the beat, yet somehow his idea of where he wanted the beat to be became lost to us. What could be responsible for this? I see 3 possibilities here. It could be that the beat is just a fancy of the creator of music, unimportant for the listener. Or it could be that the beat is always in the music, but only those who are musically developed can hear it. Yet another possibility is that the beat is present not in all, but only in some pieces of music. Okay, I think we can safely discard the first option. There are zillions of music pieces where the beat pulse is completely obvious to the mass audience, for instance in waltzes or tangos. And even in our example, Schumann's idea of a beat can be effectively communicated to listeners if the performer ignores Schumann's indications to slow down and pause. Now you can actually hear the beat in this music. But if showing or not showing the beat can be decided by the performer, then this means that the beat pulse is real and not just a figment of the composer's imagination. This leaves us with only two options. One is that the beat is omnipresent, yet potentially elusive, or two, that it is present only in some forms of music, but not in all. So let's start with the first option. Obviously, beat is absolutely necessary for any form of music that involves more than one performer. Unless each performer hears the beat performed by their partner, playing in sync with others is just impossible. And even significant fluctuations in the beat's pulse do not prevent musicians from staying in sync, as we shall see in our next example. Here, both the pianist and the cellist are playing exactly the same melody in perfect sync, note for note. And this is despite the constant alternation between speeding up and slowing down that causes the beat to shrink or expand all the time. Faster tempo makes the beat shorter, whereas slower tempo makes the beat longer. But somehow, this unsteadiness does not appear as a deformation to the listeners. We do realize that an unsteady beat is a part of the special expression in this music that conveys a volatile and moody character. Such a capricious style of performance has a special name. It is called rubato. We can recognize rubato by momentary and smooth changes in the duration of a few adjacent beats, while keeping more or less the same average pace. Listen to how playing rubato affects the duration of the beats. But here we have a problem. It is quite common to see definitions of beat that stress its regularity as a keynote. The Oxford Dictionary, for instance, defines musical beat as a regular rhythmic sound or movement. The Cambridge Dictionary defines it as a regular emphasis or a place in the music where such an emphasis is expected. And the Merriam-Webster defines it as a metrical or rhythmic stress in poetry or music, or the rhythmic effect of these stresses. According to these definitions, our examples of Schumann and Brahms did not contain the beat, because there was no regularity in the performer's playing. The pace of the music was irregular rather than regular. And yet, Quite confusingly, as we saw in our Schumann example, the irregular music could have been potentially performed with a regular beat. Decisions whether to play regularly or irregularly are routinely made by performers when interpreting a particular piece of music. And quite often they choose to ignore the composer's indications in a music score. Even when a composer clearly asks to keep a strict time by writing tempo giusto, which means in strict tempo, at the beginning of a score, performers resort to rubato, sometimes rather grotesque, and listeners find it totally appropriate. If you think that this particular performance was exceptional, try to find one that strictly keeps the beat throughout Chopin's music. And if you do, please let me know. But don't cite a MIDI-generated performance. So, beat regularity is, in fact, optional. Definitions of beat should not refer to its regularity as a criterion. Then, is the beat just a stylistic embellishment left to the performer's discretion? But if so, what is the point of notating it? Could it be that dictionaries are simply wrong and that the beat is not really regular? Let's take some music that appears to have a steady and regular beat and examine if that's indeed the case. Here is a recording of Beethoven's Coriolan overture that gives the impression of keeping the same pace. Now, let's define the pace of its beginning and generate a click track locked at this pace. And now, let's see if the click track stays in sync with the continuation of this music. As you could hear, the music went out of sync in a matter of seconds. And this is what you will find in virtually every performance that appears to keep a strict beat, even by those conductors who were champions of strict timing, like Felix Weingartner or Karl Böhm, both of whom were internationally acclaimed for this. The regularity of the beat turns out to be nothing but an illusion. In reality, even when a performer wants to keep the beat steady, he cannot help but start rushing whenever the music features something exciting in the melody, harmony, or rhythm. And the same applies to relaxation. Such fluctuations are simply inevitable. They constitute a human feel, without which music will be perceived as mechanistic, unemotional, and static. Scientists call this phenomenon expressive timing. Expressive timing is what allows us to tell a machine-generated MIDI recording from human performance. Experimental research shows that listeners expect to hear music expressively timed, and if they don't hear this expressive timing, they compensate for its absence by imagining it. Expectation of expressive timing is a result of recognizing familiar music structures while listening. We keep looking ahead as long as the music goes on. And as for performers, they are simply not capable of playing musical compositions metronomically correct in the absence of a metronome click, even when trying really hard to play in strict time. In real life, as experimental evidence shows, the timing of metronomic playing turns out to be similar to expressive playing. Figure 3 compares the average profiles for expressive timing and metronomic timing in the performance of 6 pianists playing the E major etude by Chopin. The blue curve shows the fluctuation of pace when pianists were asked to play in strict time, but without the use of a metronome, relying only on their own metronomic sense. The red curve shows the pace when pianists were asked to play expressively. Quite noticeably, each metronomic performance, blue curve, shows traces of expressive performance, red curve. The peaks and dips of both red and blue curves mostly coincide. Had the metronomic performance been indeed regular, you would have seen a straight blue horizontal line. Instead, you see curves where rises indicate deceleration, that is, increase of the beat duration, and declines, acceleration, that is, decrease of the beat duration. Moreover, the plots of all 6 performers share more or less the same disposition of peaks, indicating that all the pianists followed the same model of expressive performance. It is possible that the systematic timing variation in metronomic playing merely reflects an insufficient effort by the pianists to suppress the expressive urges, but more likely, this is an unavoidable consequence of the processing of musical structure. While playing, all 6 pianists recognized a familiar musical structure and performed it according to the same model. You can see this model in the following figure. It shows the average timing of the opening 5 bars of 115 commercial recordings of Chopin's Etude in E major, as well as 18 advanced student pianists who sight-read it on a digital piano. The expressive timing of professional pianists is marked by red, while that of students by green. Both curves are remarkably similar. Above the plot, you can see how the bars of the music score correspond to accelerations and decelerations of the performers. Longer notes of the melody cause performers to slow down, whereas shorter notes preceding them to speed up. There is considerable evidence that such consistent correspondences between the patterns of expressive timing and the patterns of rhythm, pitch, or harmony, which all are structural, are not unique to this particular example. Each common structural pattern in music seems to be associated with a specific pattern of expressive timing. Typical expressive timing can be based on intuition rather than active analysis of musical score. Music can speak for itself. In a word, performers intuitively learn to cognitively chunk each common progression of musical sounds according to the same convention. Important sounds become stressed through slowing down, whereas unimportant, passing sounds are slightly accelerated. As a result, a recognizable pattern of expressive performance is formed and assigned to a corresponding melodic, rhythmic, or harmonic pattern. This is what can be called a conventional musical idiom. In the case of Repp's study, such idioms are melodic. Bruno Repp identified them as motifs that consisted of 2 to 6 notes and ended on a long note. They are marked by red brackets in the score. Listeners get used to hearing such idioms along with their respective expressive timing. The evidence for this is a close match between the pianist's average profiles of expressive timing and the average detection accuracy of listeners. The pianist's profile is shown in the lower panel, while the listener's profile in the upper panel. The correlation between the two profiles is 0.9. What this means is that slower portions of the pianist's curves are harder to time for the listeners. This suggests that listeners expect to hear a typical timing pattern. When a performer plays a common pattern of musical sounds in an expressive timing that is not conventional, listeners tend to dislike it because of their preference for conventional expressive timing. But sometimes a performer might convince the audience that this new non-conventional timing is more expressive than the conventional one. In that case, there is a chance that a new convention will be formed, which will then override the earlier convention. This is not that different from the idiomatic expressions in language. Every music culture can be characterized by an assortment of common musical idioms, some of which eventually become outdated and replaced with new ones. Technically speaking, it should be possible to establish a lexicon of musical idioms for every music culture by means of computer learning. Because of this conventionality of expressive timing, beat deviations constitute a status quo in the historic development of music cultures. In Rep's words, with regard to Western notated music, there is a widespread tendency to think of expressive timing as deviations from a default metronomic timing implied by the score, deviations that are introduced deliberately by a performer. The present results suggest instead that typical expressive timing is an integral part of music, and that it is therefore neither a deviation nor deliberate, whereas a metronomic performance, even an imaginary one, is a distortion. A performer who wishes to be faithful to the score should, and usually will, play with typical timing, not metronomically. What follows from the research of Rep and his colleagues is that in general, beat fluctuations are caused by music competence. Once a performer recognizes a musical idiom in the music that is performed, he marks its salient points by speeding up or slowing down, which alters the duration of the relevant beats. This is not different from how speakers intuitively mark the boundaries of a phrase by changes in pace. Such alterations help listeners to break the flow of sounds into meaningful segments. Metronomically accurate performance can occur only where performers just play notes. That is, when they don't actually relate what they are playing to the musical idioms that are conventional to the type of music they are playing. So, a musical beat is inherently flexible, and the extent of this flexibility varies from piece to piece. Music, such as in our first example with Schumann, does not destroy the beat, it only maximizes this inherent flexibility. The beat pulse in Schumann's music doesn't disappear in performances with intense rubato, it only becomes distorted. Here it would be appropriate to bring up the parallel between the musical beat and the heartbeat. Once the heartbeat is turned on, it keeps beating throughout one's life and fluctuates in its rate depending on one's activities, resting, or emotional state. And it stops beating when one's life comes to an end. In the same way, the musical beat also turns on as soon as the music begins and keeps beating and fluctuating until the music ends. So a curve in the tempo plot of a piece of music that reflects accelerations and decelerations of the musical beat resembles a curve of the daily changes in heart rate. Just as the heartbeat can become uneven and feeble, the musical beat can also become unsteady and weak. But does this parallel stretch any further? Obviously, without the heartbeat, a person cannot stay alive. But can a piece of music go on without the beat? Musicologists don't give a definite answer. They list a number of music genres and styles that they characterize as free and unmeasured, which implies a lack of clarity in the beat. This list is not that long, and many genres in it are quite esoteric, for instance, recitative secco or melodrama. However, it is far from clear whether all of these genres are indeed beat-free. Musicologists can only speak about the structures of music that are fixed in musical notation or in sound recordings. Musicologists cannot penetrate in the minds of musicians and listeners and tell whether or not they are actually tracking the beat. Measuring the perception of music is the job of scientists, and here scientists are divided. Some of them categorically state that beat is a fundamental property of music that distinguishes it from non-music and allows humans to make music together and move to music as in dances or marches. They support this conclusion with the evidence that newborns can detect periodicities induced by varying rhythms, and that beat induction can occur automatically in adults when they hear music. But other scientists disagree that there is no music without beat, and point to such forms of music as recitative, plain song, or modern ambient music that do not make the listeners tap their foot or nod their head to music, which these scientists interpret as the absence of beat. In their opinion, such types of music constitute a large proportion of the world's music. It is true that at least some of the known musical genres don't show any discernible pulse that could be regarded as beat. As a rule, such genres belong to solo music. A good example of this is the so-called unmeasured preludes of the 17th century. They even look noticeably different from normal measured preludes in their notation. Here you can see both notations side by side. The one on the left is unmeasured, whereas the one on the right, in the middle of the page, becomes quite literally measured. The music becomes broken into measures, marked with the bar lines. It is interesting to see that Louis Couperin has marked the beginning of this measured fragment of his unmeasured prelude with the words "change of movement." Evidently, he perceived measured and unmeasured movements as different in expression. When writing down unmeasured preludes, composers only notated the most basic pitch scheme for a performer to improvise on. All pitches were written in whole notes without any indication of how long or short each note should be. This is how an unmeasured section notated in the score actually sounds. As the term suggests, unmeasured preludes prevent any measuring of musical time. In effect, this makes the music beatless. The idea of this type of music is to toy around with a selected pattern of notes as though warming up to get ready for a more technically challenging music. This is what the term prelude implies. And it is this unmeasuredness that generates craving and expectation for some kind of beat to appear. I must stress that it is in fact the solo setting that enables the unmeasured performance of such preludes. But other common examples of free-timed musical genres are not nearly beatless. Timing in plain chant is often explained as the replacement of musical rhythm with speech rhythm due to the priority of holy texts over music. By the 13th century, the term plain chant meant to imply a manner of singing that was free and unmeasured, in contrast to other forms of vocal music of the day. But let's listen to a canonic Christian hymn, Veni Creator Spiritus, attributed to Rabanus Maurus, a 9th century German monk. You can see its medieval notation next to its modern transcription. This hymn is commonly performed in a Gregorian chant setting by a male choir singing in unison. Would you say that this hymn lacks musical beat?
Veni Creator Spiritus, mentes tuorum visita, implesso per la gratia, que tu creasti pectora.
As you could hear, most of the time a syllable in the text was given a dedicated pitch, and all such pitches retained about the same duration value. Some syllables of more important words were sung over two pitches, such as the word creator, while retaining the same duration value of a single note. Brief pauses were inserted at the end of each phrase. All in all, the music went by a more or less steady pulse, much steadier than the earlier example of Schumann. And this is to be expected whenever music is performed by more than one musician, even in cases like Veni Creator that we just listened to. There, a single soloist kept measuring the music in the same way as he used to do while singing Gregorian repertoire in the choir together with his partners. Traditions of collective performance have great influence over traditions of solo performance. As we see, some free time genres comply with the beat, some don't, and yet others fall somewhere in between. A good example of the latter is the so-called musique mesurée, developed in France at the end of the 16th century and highly esteemed at the royal court. Here is a 5-part chanson by Claude Lejeune, master of the king's music for Henry IV. The syllables of a poetic text were assigned quantitative values. An accented syllable received a duration twice longer than an unaccented syllable. This prosodic scheme is printed in the score above the music. Unaccented syllables are indicated according to the convention of poetic versification by the brevis sign. Accented syllables are indicated by the longum sign. Their succession represents a poetic line that you can read as a progression of short and long syllables, while longum is twice longer than brevis. Now you can see how this progression matches the syllables of the lyrics in the music score. It is measured according to the duration of syllables in the text. The resulting rhythm appears as a sporadic alternation between a 2-beat and a 3-beat pattern. In case you had trouble tracking the beat and had to reset from time to time, let me now give you a tip. You probably focused on longum, which threw you off. This time, let's try to zoom in a shorter pulse and focus on brevis as a beat unit. I'll help you by flashing the beat in the score in sync with the music. I hope that this time you were able to track the beat better. The strategy to scan the flow of music in search of the shortest pulse comes handy in cases that are intricate. Sometimes a longer pulse can attract our attention and make us erroneously feel that the music is unmeasured. Such incidents should be taken to indicate that beat detection relies on the knowledge of music. A listener familiar with conventions of plain chant and musique mesurée will look for the beat in syllables of the text rather than in music. So, is beat fundamental to music? Unfortunately, the final answer has to wait until we address the problem between musicologists and scientists. The absolute majority of musicologists and musicians do not know much about psychoacoustics and are not aware of the advances in research and perception and production of music. However, they do know the technicalities of how various music forms are arranged. On the contrary, scientists are much better informed on how the ear and the brain process specific attributes of music, but they often lack the knowledge of the typologies of music structures and the history of music. In a word, musicologists and musicians have trouble understanding what beat actually is, whereas scientists have trouble understanding how the supposedly beat-free forms of music, such as recitative and plain chant, are composed and performed. Now that we examined the supposed beat-free music and saw how different pulses can be adopted as a beat, it's time to establish what exactly constitutes the beat in music. We have already seen how the Oxford Dictionary and the likes of it erroneously reduce the definition of musical beat to the criterion of regularity. But what about musical dictionaries? The Grove Dictionary of Music defines beat as the basic pulse underlying mensural music that is the temporal unit of a composition. Also, the movement of the hand or baton by which the conductor indicates that unit. This definition ties the concept of musical beat to the practice of beating time to music. The earliest evidence of time beating dates back all the way to the 25th century BC, ancient Egypt. This painted relief from the tomb of Nenkef depicts two time beaters, sitting with their backs to each other and showing the beat to two flute players who are facing them. This is part of a larger composition, depicting time beaters on the left of a harpist. The lower row shows dancers directed by two clappers on the right. The positioning of these two groups next to each other seems to suggest that what clappers are for dancers is what time beaters are for musicians. Multiple reliefs of the Old Kingdom depict time beaters guiding musicians with specific hand signals, which is called cheironomy, meaning hand movements made in the air to guide a musical performance. Such practice makes perfect sense, since Mesopotamian courts of the 3rd millennium BC became famous for maintaining large-scale ensembles that included vertical harps, large and small lyres, and singers. Their collective performance certainly needed coordination and time. The surviving documents suggest that the accuracy of music performance was strictly regulated and supervised by priests and scribes. Deviations from the rules were believed to jeopardize the harmony of the spheres and risk bringing misfortune to the entire state. That is why professional musicians had to follow strict rules and be servile, as evident from this rare Akkadian seal of a lute player. The seals were used to sign important documents, so the kneeling position of a lute player depicted on his seal, his subverting himself to the authority of gods, rulers and warriors, is highly representative of the musician's servile status in early Mesopotamian states. Musicians had to obey the multitude of rules that regulated their playing. After 2300 BC, orchestras further expanded with the addition of many more instruments: harps, bull harps, big drums, kettle drums, small drums, and clappers. By the early 2nd millennium BC, orchestras grew to around 15 performers and included flutes, cymbals, and lutes. Such large ensembles simply could not play without a loud time beating. Drummers, cymbals players, and clappers seem to have served this purpose. Orchestral music became the object of prestige and competition between neighboring states, such as Egypt, Babylon, and Hatti. By the time of the New Kingdom in Egypt, temple and court orchestras were commonly engaged in funeral rituals, in royal celebrations, as well as in entertainment. Teaching music was also based on clapping the beat. It is worth noting that the very hieroglyph for music, a Hesed hieroglyph, is a pictograph of a raised hand, probably of a time beater. This reproduction of the relief with two harpists, directed by two time beaters, shows two Hesed hieroglyphs placed above the time beaters. In the 4th century BC, it was common to teach music by singing or playing while beating the time on the board placed under the musician's foot to amplify the tapping. On this mosaic, you see an aulos player, aulos is a double flute, stamping on a board with his foot. Flute players were in charge of marking the beat. To stomp louder, they usually wore wooden shoes. Footwear is clearly depicted on many images of Greek and Roman flutists. And rhythm was always measured in terms of foot tapping, both practically and theoretically. When Greek and Roman theorists discussed timing in poetic verses, they used the term pous, literally meaning foot, as a unit of measurement. This unit was either stressed or unstressed, and foot tapping showed the alternation between the two. The sounds that accompanied the silent rising motion were called arces. They were lighter than the sounds that fell on the loud stomp, called theses. In effect, tapping motion of the foot was used as a beat pulse to measure the temporal organization of both poetry and music. This practice was amazingly long-lived. It survived the Dark Ages and continued well into the modern era. Just like the ancient Egyptian bands, Christian choirs also employed chironomy to synchronize the singing of choir members with the singing of the congregation. A choir master, wearing black in this picture, used one hand to show which pitch to sing and another hand to indicate rhythm, sometimes with the help of a little stick resembling our modern conductor's baton. This practice of silent time beating, designed not to disturb the fluidity of singing, found its way to secular music, first and foremost in opera, as orchestral accompaniment became customary in the early 17th century, spreading all over Western Europe. Often, music directors held a scrolled music score in their hands to mark the beat. In this picture, published in 1732, you can see Johann Kuhnau conducting at the St. Thomas Cathedral in Leipzig with two scrolls. By the way, the organist here is probably Bach. What is important is that Kuhnau faces the congregation rather than the orchestra, which suggests that time beating was prioritized for the audience. At the same time, loud time beating was widely used in practice sessions of large ensembles. Of course, professional musicians of that time had enough skills to play well without any time beating, which they did in chamber music. However, when there were many musicians involved in performance, and especially if they had to sit far away from each other, then they needed a clear cue. In some theaters, there were two pits, as shown in this picture, one on the far right and another on the far left. So the conductor had to stand on stage between both pits to be seen by all performers. In the 17th, 18th centuries, Grand Opera in Paris kept a position for a time beater. His job was to heavily hit the floor with a long and ornamented wooden stick that looked like a cane. This job was quite prestigious. Here you can see the distinguished French Baroque composer, Jean-Pierre Robel, who held the position of a time beater at the Royal Academy of Music. An international celebrity of the time, Jean-Baptiste Lully, became the unfortunate victim of time beating. During the performance of his Te Deum in 1687, he accidentally hit his own foot with the conducting cane. Because he refused amputation, since he wanted to be able to dance for the production of his ballets for the court, he died a month later from gangrene. As you see from this little historical sketch, musicians and listeners have been tracking the beat in music from the earliest stages in history, and time beating was a dedicated musical profession. This already suggests that beat is not an organic part of a music composition. Otherwise, everyone would be aware of it just as they are aware of pitches and rhythms they hear in music. The historical need for time beating demonstrates that people tend to disagree in the perception of beat and need a competent referee to bring them to some agreement, without which a collective performance is problematic or even not possible. It's worth noting that across different cultures, beat was demonstrated through the motion of a foot or a hand, which revealed the inherent connection between musical movement and physical movement. From the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries, marking the beat became the job of the conductor, a new musical profession. Instead of playing a musical instrument or singing, the conductor was responsible for keeping time in a way that was most beneficial for the expression of a specific piece of music. A great violinist and composer, Pablo Sarasate, used to make fun of the seeming uselessness of conductors as compared to other musicians. Once he told his composer friend, Granados, that he would love to see a conductor entertaining the audience all by himself, in the absence of any performers, just like Sarasate did with his violin in his solo recitals. Indeed, the conductor's silent performance stands in polar opposite to the audible performance of musicians. And watching a chain of silent conductors' expressions in the absence of musicians would certainly be a strange experience, perhaps ludicrous at times. You can get some idea by looking at the gallery of photographs taken during the performances of Nicolaus Harnoncourt. Just imagine how they would look without an orchestra playing. In contrast, facial and gestural expressions of performers look appropriate no matter how intense they may be, so long as their faces match the expression of the sound we hear. Moreover, the mastery of a performer like Sarasate is immediately obvious to a common audience, but the mastery of a conductor is obvious only to the orchestral musicians. And this is yet another indication that beat fundamentally differs from what is notated in the music score. Orchestra musicians perform the notated music, whereas conductors perform the beat, amongst other things, such as showing how loud or soft the music should be. This division of labor is there to enable large-scale performance. In modern practice, ensembles of less than 10 participants normally perform without a conductor. In such a case, one of the performers, usually the first violin, adopts the role of a leader, showing musical timing by movements of the head or body while playing. The larger the number of participants, the greater visibility of expressive motions, and greater suggestive power is needed to carry out a particular expression. This, along with the growing complexity of music during the Romantic period, is what brought to life and established the new profession of a conductor. By the 1820s, quite a number of conductors in Germany pioneered noiseless conducting, focusing exclusively on the expressive properties of music. To their contemporaries, this seemed rather unusual. We have numerous accounts of Beethoven's attempts to convey various expressions at the podium. Ludwig Spohr described Beethoven's performance of his Seventh Symphony in 1814 as rather eccentric and even comical. Beethoven kept crouching down more and more, almost creeping to show a delicate softening. Or he kept raising himself on his toe tips, spreading his arms wide, seeming to soar upwards to the skies when showing a massive crescendo. Although such expressions looked eccentric, the performance was highly successful. It was repeated 4 days later, producing combined net receipts of 4,006 florins, a huge sum of money at the time. And Beethoven was begged to conduct his music again and again. Some musicians found his conducting erratic and misleading, which resulted in the administration employing another conductor, Michael Umlauf, to stand behind Beethoven, invisible to the audience, and conduct the orchestra in a more conventional way. Nevertheless, as time went by, Beethoven's exploration of expressive gestures caught up with younger conductors. Just 30 years later, Liszt was employing exactly the same expressions in his conducting, as you can see in these 2 life sketches drawn during Liszt's recital. However, the conducting gestures that eventually became standard kept bringing about a plethora of caricatures that artists continue to create even today. Here are some common expressions captured in a few caricatures in the 1960s. Diminuendo, that is getting softer. Con sforza, that is loudly with force. Both of these pictures reproduce the expressions of Beethoven and Liszt, by the way. Preciso, which means precisely in tempo, without rubato. Rallentando, which means gently relaxing and slowing down. Affettuoso, which is passionately, with much feeling. And finally, amoroso, lovingly. It is the peculiar combination of posture and gesture that enables you to see which expression the conductor wants the orchestra to produce. We can say that conducting replaced the practice of marking the beat with the practice of showing the character of the beat. Much of conducting goes into using expressive gestures to characterize the beat in order to inspire performers. Will Earhart, one of the founders of the Music Educators National Conference and its president in 1915, identified at least 8 aspects of expression of conductor's beat in his wonderful textbook on conducting. I'll list the most important of the 8. The most basic aspect that we already covered when discussing arsis and thesis is beat's directionality. The descending beat communicates strength, power, emphasis, and energy. The ascending beat is light and full of anticipation. All other beats are somewhat balancing in their relative weight or emphasis of the rhythmic moments they signalize. Extent or length of beat conveys the degree of earnestness or vigor of feeling and the freedom of release of that feeling. For example, long sweeping beats project confidence, expansiveness, fearlessness, strength, and fullness of tone. Short beats relate to small, thin, light tones, suitable for playful, coquette, dreamy, wary, dull, or mysterious moods. Weight of beat is determined by the involvement of the body. The lightest beat is generated by the wrist alone, whereas the heaviest by the whole trunk. Great weight conveys ruggedness, determination, heroic grandeur, and intensity of passion. Tension often accompanies weight, but can bear its own expression, reflected by the constriction of hand and arm muscles. Expression of grief, fear, apprehension, failing powers, largely negative emotions, are associated with tension. Elevation is important for phrasing. It generates the sense of expectation, whereas the reversal of elevation, depression, produces the sense of finality. The prevalence of elevated beats in music acts as the opposite of tension. It induces lightness, delicacy, jubilation, happiness, aspiration, and exaltation. Rapidity of the baton defines every beat stroke. Swift and incisive beats articulate the bite of crisp, delicate, and clear-cut passages, or sparse, detached, and dry sounds. Slow and floating beats are typical for smooth, singing-like expressive melodies. The combination of these 6 most important parameters of time beating forms what can be called beat signature, similar to how time signature characterizes each musical movement. Professional conductors distinguish between different beat signatures just like they distinguish between the conducting schemes of different time signatures. The most common conducting schemes are well known amongst classical musicians: 2-beat vertical up and down, 3-beat triangular, 4-beat crisscross, and 6-beat extended crisscross. Less known is the fact that conductors show each beat in such schemes by a dedicated curve that reflects the above-mentioned 6 parameters. This is how the 2, 3, and 4-beat patterns actually look to the orchestral musicians. Each strike is curved in a particular way. And this is how conductors show each discrete beat, as found in a study that recorded conductors' gestures and measured the viewer's response to them. Viewers reacted differently to the differences in the curvatures of the beats. Experienced conductors were more diverse and influential than inexperienced conductors. In each plot, the direction of the gesture is indicated by the letters going from A to B. This is how the variation in the extent of the beat in a 3-beat pattern appears to musicians of the orchestra. Prolongation of a beat results in greater rounding of the trajectory, generating a noticeably different shape. The differences are most prominent in fast tempo and when executed by more experienced conductors. A follow-up study by the same authors revealed that viewers also respond to what Earhart called beat rapidity, the relative speed of the conductor's hand. The response was discovered at each of the segments of the conducting curve. In this figure, changes in rapidity are shown under the conducting curves, where darker areas indicate slower speed. Large, small, and medium extents of the gesture are each characterized by its own speed and acceleration profile. Differentiation in size, shape, speed, and acceleration of beat signatures enables the conductor to display characteristic differences in the beat pulse between compositions that have exactly the same time signature. For instance, two movements from the Per Gynt suite by Grieg both engage the same 4-beat time signature, but both differ in the expressive quality of the beat, therefore requiring different conducting gestures. The beat of Asa's death is heavy yet short, engaging the restricted motion of a full arm, quite tense and rigid, with minimal elevation and considerable restraint. Compared to Asa's death, the movement in the Hall of the Mountain King features a lighter beat, about equally tense and low in elevation, but more impulsive and detached. Evidently, musical compositions can be characterized by the specific configuration of 6 expressive aspects of the beat: downbeat, upbeat, long short, heavy light, lax tense, depressed elevated, and slow swift. Quite a number of musical genres are distinguished by the beat type they favor. The dance beat differs from the march beat and the lullaby beat. Their differences are determined by different applications of the music. March beat supports collective walking, dance beat such individual movements as leaping, stomping, turning around, and lullaby beat gentle rocking from side to side. And this beat differentiation, obvious to virtually anyone raised within the same music culture, is not limited to art music alone. Western popular music follows pretty much the same principle in contrasting beats: short and long, swift and slow, heavy and light, and upbeats and downbeats. Almost every genre of popular music has a characteristic beat signature, easily recognized and described in terms of these 4 aspects that Earhart formulated for the conductor's beat. The profession of the drummer in popular music is similar to that of the conductor in classical music. Both identify and interpret the beat in a given piece of music. A good drummer, like a good conductor, can make the beat expressive. The drum set was adopted by Western popular music as a standard accompaniment instrument toward the end of the 19th century. This is when timekeeping became the job of the drummer. As genres and styles of popular music kept growing and diversifying, the drummer's ability to give a characteristic touch to the beat according to a given style of music became the landmark of the drumming profession. Perhaps the need for style-specific beats is most obvious in the emergence of drum machines and their spread all over the world. Drum machines offer an assortment of characteristic drumming patterns for most common popular genres. We can characterize a drummer's beat by 4 parameters: directionality, extent, weight, and rapidity. Upbeat, downbeat, backbeat, and offbeat are 4 different types of beat that differ in their directionality and timbre. Drummers choose different percussive instruments and strikes to emphasize the difference between each of them. Downbeat and backbeat are generally stronger than upbeat and offbeat. Drummers use different parts of their arm and wrist to diversify their beat in a way not that different from how conductors use their arms and wrists to emphasize different qualities of the beat. Drummers engage what they call the power side of the forearm to generate stronger beats, and use the opposite side of the forearm, which they call the precision side, to generate more meticulous beats. This aspect constitutes the weight parameter. Weight and rapidity can be combined together. In weight, the strikes range from heavy to light, and in rapidity, they range in the extent of what can be called bite. When the drummer accelerates his hand motion, it affects the bounce of his arm, which then generates a somewhat nippy sound. The faster the acceleration, the snappier the contact. The combination of weight and rapidity can distinguish different styles of popular music even when they employ exactly the same time signature. Let's listen to perhaps the most common drumming pattern of 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, which drummers call straight eighth notes. At first I am going to play the rock version of it, followed by the jazz version. And now listen to the disco pattern that is closer to rock than to jazz. In the drumming practice of popular music, the following typology of beats has become conventional. The on-beat pulse is opposed to the off-beat pulse. Their names are very descriptive of what they are. On-beats fall on the beat itself, whereas off-beats fall in between the beats. The second and fourth beats are called backbeats. They contrast the first and the third beats in their weight. If the first and the third beats are heavier, then the second and the fourth ones would be lighter, or vice versa. The first beat is called downbeat, what the ancients called thesis, and it opposes the fourth beat, which is called upbeat. The ancients called it arsis. The fourth beat can as though lead into the downbeat, so that you would hear something like 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. However, in popular music, this opposition is less common than the previous two. The very existence of these types of beats goes to prove that beat requires interpretation. When a band chooses to play jazz, rock, or disco, its members agree on the particular interpretation of the beat that suits their desired style and expression. Then the drummer tweaks the parameters of a drumming beat and forges an optimal beat signature for a given piece of music. Different beat signatures can be distinguished by the differences in their parameters. In this graphic representation of the straight eighth note pattern, each sound is shown as a rectangle, where its width indicates relative duration, height, loudness, and rises or drops in a baseline level, changes in pitch. The disco beat is a little longer, not as detached as the rock beat. Compared to rock, the disco offbeats are much louder and quite higher, while its backbeats are longer and not as high. And the jazz beats are by far smoother than both rock and disco. In addition to being well interconnected, they are more diverse. Jazz odd offbeats contrast even offbeats in pitch and loudness. Now listen to all three recordings once again. An important conclusion that we can safely draw is that beat signatures of conductors in classical music and of drummers in popular music testify to the fact that beat is not objectively present in musical structures, but is constructed during the performance, as a result of the performers making sense of the performed musical structures. And each beat signature once it becomes conventional for a particular style or genre of music, obtains the formative influence over the melodies and the accompaniments created within that style or genre. It is this feedback that must be responsible for the impression that beat is somehow embedded in a music score. In reality, the score reflects the beat pulse only partially and indirectly. The notation only captures melodic, harmonic, rhythmic, and textural structures that were created according to some beat signature and not the beat itself. Beat is not composed by the composer of music in the same way as melody or accompaniment are. The composed musical structures become very much objective once they are fixed in a music score or in a sound recording. In contrast, beat is an inherently subjective phenomenon. It is generated in the individual minds of listeners, performers, and composers in response to the music structures encountered by them during listening or production of music. Perhaps nothing reveals the mental nature of the beat better than the fact that listeners experience the beat even in the absence of sound, when there are pauses in music. Listen to this fragment of Beethoven's Coriolan Overture and pay attention to where there are two long pauses in the music. I've circled them in the score. Notice that the orchestra accurately times both pauses and resumes its playing right on the beat. Here, once again, we observe that the beat to music is like the heartbeat to life. Our heart keeps beating as long as we are alive, including while we are asleep. Similarly, the beat keeps going on until the end of a music piece, throughout all the pauses. In fact, the musical term rest literally states that the musical sounds are as though temporarily resting. The vital energy of the beat is even more obvious in symphonies and sonatas that consist of multiple movements. There, listeners need quite a long silence between the movements, so that the beat in one movement would completely cease its pulse for the next movement to start afresh. The faster and longer the movement, the longer a break. That's actually why the audience is not supposed to applaud in between movements, not to disrupt the inertia and decay of the beat. A movement in music quite literally keeps moving according to the established beat. The more energetic the beat, the stronger the momentum it generates, making the inertia last longer. It is as though each musical movement possesses a certain level of vitality, just as people differ in their vigor because of a stronger or weaker heart. And this dependence of the beat on the overall energy of a musical movement makes the beat relative and volatile. Not only that two listeners might infer a different beat pulse while listening to the same music, two different performers might adopt a different beat pulse in their interpretation of the same composition. For instance, Ivan Morovets plays the E minor prelude by Chopin with the beat equal to a quarter note. But Rudolf Kerrer plays the very same music with the beat equal to a half note, twice longer than Moritz. Moravitz, in the first example, makes the movement strained as though exerting effort due to a shorter beat. In contrast, Kerrer makes the music flow effortlessly because of his choice of a longer beat. This is how musical timing differs from real-life timing. In real life, timing is absolute. We use seconds, minutes, hours, days, and weeks, all of which are a standardized duration, so that no one argues about how long a second or a minute actually lasts. In contrast, musical timing is relative. Different performers time their musical movement differently, and different listeners evaluate their timing differently too. Where one listener might be bored by a slow unveiling of music, another listener might get a kick out of a fast turn of events. A young, excited performer usually tends to play the same music faster than an old, tired performer. Now, how can this timing discrepancy be resolved? Obviously, composers want the movement of their music to proceed not faster or slower than what they deem appropriate for its character. And musicians, when they are playing together, have to try their best to commit to a beat pulse intended by the composer, despite their individual differences in age, temperament, and physique. How can we objectify the relative musical timing and measure a musical movement in a uniform manner? To measure time objectively, we need a clock. But our regular clocks are useless in estimating musical time. Musical time is not real, it is virtual. This is where virtual timing needs its own musical clock. The idea of such a device was proposed in 1592 by Lodovico Zacconi, a late Renaissance composer. Since then, there was no shortage in attempts to build a timekeeping machine. Quite a number of the inventions were put into use and gained local recognition. But it was no earlier than in 1814 that a Dutch scientist by the name of Dietrich Nicolaus Winkel invented his musical chronometer. And a year later, his Viennese colleague, Johann Nepomuk Malzel, actually stole his invention and started manufacturing it under his own name as Malzel's metronome, which was abbreviated into MM. Well, history is not always fair. This abbreviation has been adopted as a standard in music publishing, perpetuating the name of an impostor. Beethoven became the first notable composer to use the Malzel's metronome marking for specifying the tempo he wanted in his Cantato Opus 112. In essence, this marking indicates the ratio between the relative musical timing and real-life absolute timing. The notation sign of a quarter note refers to the musical timing, whereas the number 84 refers to the pace of 84 beats per minute, which is in absolute timing. In other words, Beethoven's marking tells the performer to make each quarter note 0.7 seconds long. This is how performers and listeners can all uniform their relative musical timing. They can lock on to the metronome value prescribed by the composer and stay within the boundaries of normative expressive timing, avoiding excessive fluctuations of pace. Finally, we can look into the scientific findings on the perception of beat in music. Starting from the early 1990s, the introduction of functional brain imaging in the research on beat induction opened doors to experimental verification of musicological theories of beat and rhythm. Today, after 20 years of research, the evidence is overwhelming that rhythm and beat perception is a sensory motor phenomenon. Even when a listener is not overtly moving, the motor areas of the brain are co-active with sensory areas while listening to music. A sense of motion from sound is mediated by the vestibular system, whose main function is to support the sense of balance and spatial orientation during physical motion. The vestibular system is primal to rhythm perception, and rhythm perception is body-dependent. The totality of the evidence uncovered by researchers leaves no doubt that musical beat-based timing constitutes an alternative to real-life duration-based timing. The two can be distinguished as relative versus absolute. The duration-based timing is absolute in the sense that, like a stopwatch, it attempts to discretely encode the absolute duration of time intervals. The beat-based timing is relative in the sense that it estimates the relative duration of one time interval to another, in relation to the sensory motor experience of a beat, which is extracted from the perceived music. Both modes of timekeeping activate different parts of the brain, respectively the cerebellum and basal ganglia. The cerebellum, that is the rear side of our brain, responsible for complex motor functions, subserves the perception of the absolute duration of time intervals, whereas the basal ganglia, at the base of our forebrain, mediates the perception of time intervals relative to a regular beat. You can see each of these areas separately on the functional magnetic resonance images of panels A and B. Panel C shows both areas together, where activations for absolute timing are marked yellow, whereas activations for relative timing are marked green. Neural substrates that underlie both timings are dissociated and operate with no explicit linked motor output, such as tapping. Simply speaking, we can track the beat in music without actually marking it by physical motions, and in parallel be aware of the approximate duration of the music we are listening to. Once triggered, a beat in our mind keeps beating virtually, even when we sit motionlessly, and its pulse keeps continuously adjusting to the fluctuations in the actual pace of music that we hear, momentarily resetting if the beat happens to go out of sync. The seeming paradox of the supposed regularity and actual irregularity of the beat can be explained by the predictive power of the beat. In essence, musical beat constitutes a sensory-motor loop triggered whenever we hear a series of sounds that appear to be proportionally distributed in time. This loop entraps the external auditory stimulus and generates analog motor impulses in the listener's muscular system. The time interval between two consecutive motor impulses becomes adopted as a beat as long as it periodically matches the onsets of musical sounds. Look at panel A. The matched onsets there are marked by red triangles, and the beat pulse proceeds despite a few occasional mismatches, marked by white triangles. Such an ongoing pulse enables beat prediction, which forms a distinct brain system quite autonomous from the beat detection system, yet connected to it by a direct pathway loop. In a word, beat is a unit of motoric experience, inferred from the interaction of all the rhythms in the melodic, harmonic, dynamic, and timbral contexts of a musical composition. Once established, the beat enables discrete comparison of musical durations and starts working like a look-ahead filter that assigns greater attention to the characteristics of those sounds whose onsets fall on the projected beat. As long as these onsets are just slightly off the projection and quickly come back in sync, our brain ignores the fluctuations and sticks to the previously inferred beat. This is how expressive timing does not disturb our bodily experience of the beat, especially if fluctuations accompany familiar musical idioms. Then our attention becomes redirected to these idioms, and we simply don't notice momentary shortening or prolongation of beats. But when many anticipated beats don't coincide with the onsets of audible sounds, our brain starts searching for a new effective pulse. This is when we experience the disruption of beat. If this happens a lot, we might even question whether something we hear is supposed to be measured, as in our previous example of unmeasured preludes, or even whether at all the sounds we hear constitute music and not some form of musicalized speech. Well, now let's review what we have covered in this video. There are two very important takeaways here. One is that musical beat is actually not in the music, it's in our head. We infer the beat from what we hear in music, and one person's inference might differ from another person's, provided the music is complex enough. And two is that we feel the beat in our muscles, because our experience of music is embodied. That is, we experience each piece of music as physical movement of some kind, where musical sounds as though are moving in a particular way. And this applies not only to music designed to accompany motion, such as marches, dances, or work songs, but to virtually any kind of music, with very few exceptions. And then there are two more useful points to remember. First is that musical beat is not like the clicking of a metronome. It always fluctuates, albeit slightly. It accelerates when the music becomes more excited, or it slows down when the music calms down. This is what gives music a human touch and tells human performance from the computer-generated audio. And second is that the beat can be expressive, and when it is, it needs interpretation. For this reason, if we hear a piece of music that is coming from a totally unfamiliar musical culture, we might infer the beat in that music in the wrong way. But this is not a big deal. The problem usually goes away once we learn the conventions of that music. Well, I hope that you found this video interesting and informative, so that next time you listen to music or perform it, it will be easier for you to deal with the beat. Please feel free to ask any questions and to leave comments. And don't forget to click the like button and subscribe to my channel if you enjoyed this video. Bye bye for now, and see you next time.